I'm Kimberly Harden, and I'm going to be your moderator for this evening. Tonight, we are really fortunate to have two great candidates running for District 11 State Representative. We have Mr. David Hackney and Mr. Zack Hudgins. And so tonight's forum is not a debate, and we are going to be a lot better than the political debate last night. We are going to conduct ourselves with grace and be respectful. And so, you know, I know these candidates will do that, right? That's complete opposite of what we saw last night. So we're going to have a few questions prepared around the general topic of civil rights. And then we're also going to have some very direct questions for our candidates. I encourage you all, if you have questions, please type them into the Q&A, and I will ask those questions of the candidates. So to get started, I'm going to invite each candidate to take about 3 minutes to introduce yourself and to give us some opening remarks. So, Mr. Hackney.
Thank you. So, hi, my name is David Hackney, and I'm running for state representative in the 11th District, Position 1. I'm running because representation matters. I'm running because Black lives matter, and I'm running because Black legislators matter. We actually live these issues all the time and just don't show up during campaign time to talk about it. I've been an attorney for 25 years, but I think my lived experience, it tells you more about how I'm going to behave as a legislator. I come from a proud union family. Both my grandfathers were union men. One survived the Great Depression. The other escaped the Jim Crow South because the United Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters and United Auto Workers, respectively, were working for their economic and civil rights. I'm going to fight to strengthen collective bargaining laws and address income inequality. When I started high school, guidance counselors told my parents that I was not college material. But with the love and support of my family and investments from my community, I was able to obtain degrees from Cornell University and Harvard Law School. I'm going to fight to meet the educational needs of every student so they can reach their full potential. And while in high school, my best friend was shot to death by another teenager who should have never had access to a firearm. I believe gun violence is preventable. And in Olympia, I'm going to fight for responsible gun laws. And finally, my senior year in college, my mother was diagnosed with terminal cancer at a time my family did not have health insurance. The subsequent medical bills crippled my family financially. I'm going to fight for health care for all. In this community, I volunteered to restore affirmative action, I-1000, and I was on the board and still is on the board of Tabor 100. South King County has lower average median income than the rest of King County. South King County also has experienced 77% of all the gun violence in King County in 2019. I was a volunteer to support I-1639, which raised the age of ownership for handguns, and was asked to be on the board, which I still am, of the Alliance for Gun Responsibility, where I've been fighting for regulation of high-capacity magazines. And finally, the governor appointed me to the Washington State Human Rights Commission, and I hear employment and housing discrimination cases once a month. This is a majority renters district, and my opponent was one of 4 Democrats to vote against protections for renters. I'm running because representation matters. Thank you.
Mr. Hudgins, please. Mr. Hudgins, are you still here, still with us? Okay, well, it appears that he has dropped off, likely due to technical difficulties, so we'll give him a moment to rejoin. Don't you love technology? Okay, so we'll go ahead and proceed. And then when Mr. Hudgins rejoins us, we will give him the opportunity to introduce himself and to answer the first question as well. So Mr. Hackney, what do you see as the mission of the NAACP, and how have you and how will you support the organization?
see the mission of the NAACP to be an advocate for African American, in fact, all people of color in King County, an advocate for them in ways from everything from making sure that they have same educational resources, criminal justice reform, economic reform. I believe that they have the ability to organize the community to address issues that are of particular impact to people of color and African Americans in King County. I will support them by partnering with them on legislation, identifying the most critical problems. I served last year as the legal redress chair of the King County NAACP. These issues are extremely important to me, and I'm passionate about them because they impact me as well as my community. And I think you deserve a legislator who is going to just fight for these issues with you, not just vote, but stand out and collect signatures, organize the district, do whatever it takes to get affirmative action back in the state of Washington, do whatever it takes to get police accountability 940 implemented, do whatever it takes to get responsible gun laws in the state of Washington. And I will do as much as I can in the legislature and on the Capitol, but I'm also going to organize my district and my community to stand up, to vote, and to demand better action from the government.
What do you think is the most important political issue at this time in 2020?
The most political issue is basically how do we address the economic crisis that has been caused by this pandemic? You know, the knee-jerk reaction when you have a deficit is that we have to continue to cut. I believe that an austerity budget, cutting critical social services now will only make problems worse. It will be doubling down on stupid. We are going to have to find new forms of revenue. We are going to have to support people who are unemployed with extended unemployment benefits. These are not people that are shirking work. The jobs are gone because of this economic crisis. We are going to have to support small businesses, particularly restaurants and childcare. Currently, allowing 50% capacity, the business model doesn't work for restaurants and childcare. The overhead is still there. We are losing these businesses, and they are not going to magically resurrect themselves when this pandemic is over. If we don't support them, we are going to lose critical jobs and critical businesses, many of them small businesses and minority-owned businesses. We are going to have to subsidize childcare. We are requiring parents to go back to work in some instances, and then childcare providers are closing. We are going to have healthcare for all. We have to make sure that people can get tested and treated for COVID-19, or else this pandemic is going to get worse. We're going to have to address our housing problem. Having people unhoused during a pandemic is a terrible idea. So all of those issues are going to require new sources of funding and also progressive ideas that will be implemented.
Thank you. How do you define injustice?
Injustice is when folks don't have equal access to the resources, both economic and government resources, based on something other than merit, whether it's the color of their skin, a fact that they have a disability, the fact that they are an immigrant not born in this country. You know, when they face additional obstacles to receive educational resources, healthcare resources, justice from the government resources, everything from housing and business opportunities. Injustice comes from an unequal opportunity to live your life. Everyone should have the ability to work hard, feed their family, have stable housing, and save for the future. Injustice is when those institutions, because of systemic racism and other isms, because it also immigrants, LGBTQ community, it's not just African Americans that suffer from injustice.
Thank you. Mr. Hudgins was able to rejoin us, so we're going to give him 3 minutes to introduce himself. So, Mr. Hudgins.
Thank you very much. I apologize for that. Internet trouble is something that we're all experiencing these days. I'm Zack Hudgins. I'm a state representative in the 11th Legislative District. I want to thank you for this opportunity to join you tonight. For my entire adult life, I've supported progressive candidates, causes, and issues. That's the record that I'm running on. I've marched with farm workers and healthcare workers. I've picketed with Teamsters, grocery workers, hotel workers, machinists. My entire family has been dues-paying union members, whether it's in the laborers, with ALPA, with CWA, or with AFT. I consistently support other progressive causes as well. The Green New Deal and Medicare for All. We need to fix our upside-down regressive tax system and take on systemic racism going forward. For 25 years, I've been involved in our communities, whether it's the Fisher House up on Beacon Hill that I helped start and was the board president for 2 terms that helps veterans families, or serving on the board of the Domestic Abuse Women's Network that has the only confidential women's shelter in South King County. Neighborhood groups, the PTA, and scouting as well in our communities. I believe our values manifest themselves in how we live our lives and how we choose to spend our time and our talent. I've never worked for a Republican candidate. I've never supported a Republican agenda. Now, the endorsements of my campaign, which range from environmental groups like the Washington Conservation Voters and the Sierra Club, to Planned Parenthood and NARAL, to dozens of to labor organizations, as well as elected officials across the district. They are a reflection of my work and my values in Olympia. They've joined my campaign because I've consistently solved problems and stood up against powerful interests. And this includes fighting to reform our justice system, expand our democracy, and help women and minority-owned businesses. Groundbreaking legislation that I've championed, like Breakfast After the Bell that feeds kids in our classrooms, or the DREAM Act that helps DACA students get through college. Fighting against the big tech companies to protect your privacy, or leading our Access to Democracy package that removed barriers to voting across our state, are only some of my accomplishments. And each of them showed a systemic change and a systemic difference going forward based on the problems that we faced here in the 11th District. When kids in the Tukwila School District needed to get ready for school, we helped pass Breakfast After the Bell, and that changed the way 295 school districts across the state fed kids in the classroom. It was a systemic change based in the problems we faced here in our 11th District. I am rooted and centered in our communities, and I want to continue that work on a number of fronts, including on better broadband access for everybody. Thank you very much for the time. I look forward to all the questions.
Okay, thank you. So while you were away, I asked Mr. Hackney a few questions, and I'm going to ask you the same questions and give you the opportunity to answer. So first question, what do you see as the mission of the NAACP, and how have you and how will you support the organization?
Well, I see the mission as trying to help, these days especially, break down what the organization has always seen as the systemic racism across America. I see it as creating opportunity for students through better education, through attacking and fighting disparities in health. And that means things like making sure that we've got proper LAP funding, the Learning Assistance Program, which is the proxy for better funding for poor districts, for poor school districts. It's about talking about educational disparities and trying to create better opportunity, whether it's through funding, whether it's through programs like our Workforce Investment Act, which gave a sliding scale. It fully funded our state need grant, and it gave a sliding scale to students. Up to $50,000 get free tuition to our universities, and up to $90,000 income get some access. So it's about creating opportunities for the future. It's about lowering and attacking those barriers that people face. Same thing happens when we talk about disparities around health. Places like South Park have got a 35% differential in asthma rates, for example, in children there. It's about fighting against fuels. So we have clean fuels in our state to help with carbon. It helps with making sure that we've got health disparities studies and equity studies on policies that we pass in Olympia. It's about making sure that we've passed the equity office that looks internally into state government to view problems that we face through an equity lens. And it's about talking about even our Democratic caucus of using a similar lens to bring down barriers, to fight structural hurdles, and to make our society actually move forward towards the ideals that we all profess that we want it to be.
Okay, thank you. What do you think is the most important political issue at this moment?
Well, I'll tell you that I think that the legislative session is going to focus on three, and I think that all three of them are tied together, maybe even four. We talk about a crisis with the state budget and with the economy that is caused by a crisis of our public health system and COVID. They are tied together. We talk about a reckoning and a crisis around reaching towards racial justice in our nation. And if you mix in the climate change crisis that we are also fighting, that we saw evidence of with the wildfire smoke that we saw in our communities. All of them impact the communities that I've lived in for many years, that I've represented for many years, and that we continue and need to fight for. So the number one thing is about creating opportunity. It's about bringing more awareness to the issues that compound in the neighborhoods that I love and I've lived in and that I represent. And whether that's health disparities, economic disparities, whether it's racial disparities, or whether it's about the climate crisis is going to hit these same communities in the same way. We need to recognize that. We need to close those gaps. We need to have awareness and movement forward in all of those areas.
Okay, thank you. How do you define injustice?
Well, I'll tell you, injustice is when I think you know that you're not going to get a fair shot or a fair deal. We've seen that now, especially with the distrust that has exploded in our communities around police accountability, about policing in our neighborhoods. Things that I've heard for years from people in my neighborhoods and my communities, that they don't always trust the police, that they don't want the police always to come to their aid. We are seeing this idea that everyone is not treated the same. We are not all treated the way we would ideally like to be treated, whether it is because of the zip code you grow up in or whether it's your skin color. That's the injustice that we have in the country right now, and that's how I define it. It is that not only is there not an equitable treatment, but there's not an equal treatment across the board for folks. And those are the injustices that we need to attack and move forward and make progress on.
Okay. What's your position on Black Lives Matter, and what will you do to assist in achieving its goals?
I support Black Lives Matter. David and I have seen each other at a couple of marches in Tukwila and in Renton, and I publicly said that. I'll tell you, 2 years ago when we started talking about Initiative 940 on the House floor, there was a lot of discussion in that floor debate about the big sort of celebratory agreement that was made between law enforcement and families. And I stood on the floor of the House, and this is 2 years ago, and I spoke the voices that I heard in my community. I mean, these are the voices that centered me. And I tried to remind members of the floor, on the floor, that Black Lives Matter and say her name, and the victims of this police violence was why we were there. It wasn't because we had a big kumbaya moment with families. It was because people in the communities rose up and demanded change. So I've supported it, and I've spoken it on the floor of the House 2 years ago, before we had the large-scale civil unrest we've got now. Back when we were talking about the movement starting in Ferguson, starting about this distrust. These are the concerns that have been in my community for a long time, and I've stood up publicly and supported it. Now, we've put together a full agenda, everything from trying to demilitarize the police, trying to create outside accountability, outside investigations, subpoena power, trying to create more transparency around misconduct records around police. All of those ideas I support as well. And we're going to be moving forward with that, I hope, next legislative session to try and bring more justice, more transparency, more accountability to the relationship between police and communities that they are involved in and oversee and help with. We really need to shift the discussion from an enforcement to a protective role, and the state has a big role in that. And since the state oversees all of that behavior, the state trains all of the officers in the entire state through the criminal justice training facility, and we can set standards, we can set certification requirements, we can revoke those certifications as well. And I think that it's the state's role to move forward on all of those items.
Okay, thank you. Same question, Mr. Hackney. What is your position on Black Lives Matter, and what will you do in achieving its goals?
Sure. Black Lives Matter is a social movement, but it's also a call to action to dismantle systemic racism in various institutions in our society. You know, I Can't Breathe was not first uttered with police brutality. It was first uttered with respect to environmental injustice, where African Americans suffer more respiratory diseases than other groups because of lack of access to healthcare and, of course, of environmental racism. But it's not about just saying the words. So when my opponent says he says the words Black Lives Matter and say their names in the legislature, what he's not saying is he hasn't done anything actually to achieve it. These are not new issues. He's been in office for a long time. The Seattle Police Department has been under a federal consent decree now for almost 10 years. So whatever he says he's going to do, the question is, why hasn't he done it? We are looking for action now. We are tired of talking. We've all been to enough forums. He's heard all of my answers. He repeats a lot of them, you know, during these forums now, and his answers have improved dramatically. And that sounds great. But what he can improve on is his past record, his failure to actually take steps to address the militarized police force, the use of force by the Seattle Police Force, to actually get out in the streets and to work with the implementation of 940, to actually work on these issues, to work on issues of mass incarceration and others. And that's what we're seeing is we can all talk the talk. And he can come back every campaign, every 2 years and say all the things you want to hear. But what he can't do is change his record, and which is why I'm running, which is his lack of action on these critical issues in South King County.
Okay, thank you. So the second part of that question is, what will you do to assist in achieving its goals? So would you mind answering that question, please?
Sure, what I've been doing, you know, working to restore affirmative action to the state, working on responsible gun laws, which impact people of color more, working to prevent housing and employment discrimination on the Washington State Human Rights Commission, actually partnering with community organizations. I was a member of the board of the Seattle King County. I'm a member of the board of Tabor 100. And either of those organizations, I never once saw my opponent. He tells me he makes a big deal about being a part of them. I didn't see him come to any meetings, any issue forums. He wasn't someone that we could call on when we needed him. When high capacity magazines needed assistance on the House floor, he didn't answer that call. When I-1639, when we were doing press conferences and organizing the district, he didn't show up. When I-1000, again, we're looking for signatures and to get it through after, you know, R88, after it got through the legislature, he wasn't out in the streets working on it. He didn't raise money for it. So you can talk the talk, but it's really about if you're passionate about it, you're going to keep on working till the problem's solved. He said in a prior event that he voted for I-1000 twice, once in the legislature and once in my kitchen table. So what? What did you do to get the rest of your community to vote for I-1000? We lost by less than 1%. What if we had a representative that was going out, organizing the community, getting them registered to vote and focused on it? We would have affirmative action right now. I will tell you, if I was a representative, we would have affirmative action right now. We could have got that less than 1% vote from the 11th district, but we didn't have anybody that cared about it, that really acted on it.
Mr. Hudgins, would you like to take 1 minute to rebut Mr. Hackney?
Yeah, sure. You know, it's interesting that David talks a lot about where was I? David's only voted in the district one time, and he's only voted in Washington State since 2016. He's missed elections then as well. So it's interesting that he says, where was he? Well, David didn't even live in the 11th district, so he didn't see me around. He didn't see the work that I've been doing. He didn't see that I was fighting for these issues and that I've stood up and gotten support and supported these issues for years in our community. The Justice Reinvestment Program, for example, is a great idea of taking the money from better outcomes, from using the data, from using the evidence, shortening time in prison, and redirecting that towards community efforts. That is in stark contrast to David's work for the George Bush Justice Department for close to 6 years, where he was part of the problem of mass incarceration, where he was the one putting folks into prison because of all of their wrongdoing. I think that it's a real contrast when he attacks me for my record, says he hasn't seen me, but he hasn't been around to see me doing work in the communities. And at the same time, he doesn't talk about his resume working for George Bush on the war on drugs, part of what caused the problem of mass incarceration. These are the issues I stand up for in Olympia. This is what my record says. If people look at my record, I think that they'll see the truth here.
Okay.
We make it clear that
So we're going to move on. So my next question is, what is your idea of police reform? So Mr. Hackney, please.
Sure.
Go ahead.
I think this is an excellent opportunity to reimagine how we do law enforcement. We recognize now that mass incarceration and violence is not going to address the crime problem. What we really need is to have a results-oriented policy. You know, we don't need to have armed officers and militarized police force to respond to every event. What we really need is community organizations that can help mentor young people to keep them out of the criminal justice system. Community organizations that can help with reentry so that when people coming out of the criminal justice system have jobs, have safe housing. And, you know, so there's a lot we can do to reallocate funds from the militarized police force into community groups that are trusted by the community and that can address the real concerns without violence. I believe that when you show up with militarized vehicles and guns, you often incite violence. If we had community groups, if we had more people trained more as social workers to de-escalate, to work with the mentally ill, to work with communities, that we can solve a lot of these problems. And I understand that, you know, my opponent has gone negative on me, and I know why. It must be really frustrating for him. You know, he lost the primary by a large amount. He didn't get the endorsement of the 11th district that knows him the best, and he didn't get the endorsement of the Young Democrats or the King County Democrats. So I recognize now, since he ran on his record, I'm running on his record too, because his record does not do anything for him. And that's why he's in this negative campaign position. So I totally understand, but I'm going to focus on what I can do for the people of the 11th district.
Mr. Hudgins, same question. What is your idea of police reform?
Well, let's start by saying all of the things that David has said are great ideas, and we need to do those. There's a whole bunch of folks coming together. I've been on a number of those calls talking about what those specific policy proposals will look like. They're going to be one of the top priorities next legislative session. Things like demilitarizing the police. I don't think we need a machine gun in every police car. We need to diversify their ranks. We need to have subpoena power and investigative power outside of law enforcement. We've got ombudsmen for the Department of Corrections, for example, for aging services. We need something like that with real serious and enforceable power outside of law enforcement so that one law enforcement agency isn't investigating another. We need to deprioritize and decriminalize low level crimes. And we need to reimagine a little bit of the corrections system as well. I'll tell you, there's a big difference. And, you know, when we talk about our record, I don't really see it as going negative. To talk about his employment record that you can find on LinkedIn, that he worked for George Bush during the war on drugs, I don't think that's going negative. I think that's just talking about the record. And it's in real contrast to me voting to close McNeil Island State Prison down. It's in real contrast to me fighting for justice reinvestment in the legislature that would move that money towards community-based programs and away from more prison beds. I think that that's the issue here, is about how do we reimagine this stuff? How do we find what we agree on, because we do? And then what's the record show around the best track forward, whether it's going to be a corporate attorney and a former prosecutor, or it's going to be somebody that's been doing this and has the record to prove it.
Okay. So Mr. Hudgins, what is your position on defunding the police?
Well, first of all, I think that defunding the police is a bit of a misnomer. I think that we really do need to make sure that, that more money is put into community services, that we reallocate money towards community services, that we demilitarize the police, that we have more money for social workers and other folks that have access to the tools required. Right now, if somebody calls 911, their options for whatever crisis they're facing are somebody with a badge and a gun, an ambulance, or a fire truck. There might be a better answer, actually, in most cases. It would be great if they could have somebody that showed up with some mental health tools, that had some social worker tools at their disposal. And I think that's what we're talking about. When we defund the police, it's like, let's not just show up with a badge and a gun. Let's show up with some real help that those folks might need. And that's what I see when I hear defund the police. It's about finding a fourth alternative besides an ambulance, a police car, or a fire engine.
Mr. Hackney, same question. What's your position on defunding the police?
Definitely think about it as a reallocation. So what we've done now is we have armed, our police force at war against the citizens of our community. And I think, again, we need to reallocate those funds, not take them from other places, but actually take them from the police budget and use them on community-based solutions. So I'm thinking of results-oriented and policies. So the job of the police is to keep us safe, and we want to reduce crime, not just attack it after it happened. A policeman with a gun and a badge and using all of those resources for that does nothing to reduce crime. But how we reduce crime is mentoring programs, jobs programs, reentry programs, and that's what defunding means. And I am proud of my record. I was a civil servant. Started in 1993 under the Clinton administration and was a civil servant prosecutor for 11 years. And I thought that we needed African Americans to actually be in the criminal justice system and not just whites. I would attack my opponent's career over the last 18 years, but he hasn't had a permanent full-time job. So there's a blank there. And even though he hasn't had a permanent
so stop. We are not going to go with the personal attacks. We are going to stick with your positions, and we're not going to go into personal attacks.
Okay.
So my next question is, statistics show, and research has shown also, that the criminal justice system disproportionately impacts certain communities. What remedies would you put into place to make those criminal justice systems more just? So what remedies would you put into place to make criminal justice systems more just?
To whom are you directing the question?
So Mr. Hackney?
Me, okay.
Mr. Hackney, go ahead, please.
Yes. So I think we understand that mass incarceration has disproportionately impacted communities of color. And so we need to look hard at decriminalizing certain narcotics offenses and nonviolent offenses. We need to look hard at how we are policing and who gets stopped and who is being investigated more. So both from who is both being arrested and how they get treated after their arrest is how you're going to make the criminal justice system more fair. One of the ways to do that, of course, is to have more diversity and people making decisions. The other big thing is the institutions have to change. We have to recognize that, again, this mass incarceration, it is not solving the problem. We have individuals that are incarcerated. We are taking away from them out of the community. They don't have education. They don't have job skills. And when they get released, they don't have any real opportunity to contribute to the economy and to support their families. And therefore, that's where recidivism comes from. If we can address how our police forces are investigating and addressing crime, and also how the criminal justice system is adjudicating them, we can have a much better outcome.
Same question, Mr. Hudgins?
I think that there's a lot going on right now about how do we solve these problems. I believe that the federal prison system has people of color disproportionately represented by about 40%, 43%. That's a huge problem right now, and that's at the federal level. We have the same disproportional problems in Washington State as well. Although we've got a lower per capita incarceration rate in Washington State than other states. We're about 42. So we spend way too much keeping people in prison, but there are actions we can take to move forward. So not only at the front end around drug courts, family courts, veterans courts, to help folks deal with whatever problems they've got as they enter that system, but we can also look at new ideas. For example, in King County, there's a big fight about whether or not we should build a new youth jail. We should say a zero youth incarceration rate is the goal in King County right now. This is in contrast to my opponent who says that jail is a necessary tool. It's in contrast to him being a prosecutor and spending 11 years trying to put people in prison. Instead of using the data to look at how do we get our communities safer, how do we save money, and how do we help people get back on the straight and narrow. The other idea, I'll give you another small thing that we did, is we gave everybody identification cards as they came out of corrections. This was a progressive idea. It was an idea to make sure that somebody that walked out of prison from Monroe or Airway Heights or Coyote Ridge or one of the other institutions we have that hold people, that they'll have an ID card so that they can buy an order card or they can start with their life again. And my opponent criticized that. He said that it was tagging them with sort of a scarlet letter or something. And I think that there's a lot more we can do to help people get out. And we've done that with job promotion, with skills, community corrections industry, for example. I've gotten a few pastors appointed to the community corrections industry board to give folks that we hold in custody a skill set so that they can get a job when they get out. And so we also need to talk about creating generational wealth, and that means fighting systemic racism. It means about talking about the opportunity gap and the education gap, and that's proper funding. It's funding through, I mentioned already, the proxy of the LAP funding, the Learning Assistance Program. So let's start at the beginning and work our way forward. And I think that that's a little different than my opponent, who is a prosecutor and is looking backwards at the system.
My next set of questions are around education. How would you adjust the education system to make it equitable for all students? You just mentioned generational wealth, and part of creating generational wealth is actually, education. So how would you adjust the education system to make it equitable for all students? Mr. Hudgins, please.
We're trying to be on good manners. We're asking you to call on us. So well, thank you very much for the question. I've got a fourth grade son in public schools right now. I see the challenges that families in our communities face. We have over 100 languages spoken in our school districts in South King County. I've walked the halls. I've talked to classified employees. I've talked to teachers. I've talked to principals. I tell you, you want some real accountability, stand outside the school waiting for your kid to come out. And I'll tell you, parents ask you questions, the principal gets on you, the teachers talk to you about what's going on, and the school board members as well. I'll tell you, the McCleary lawsuit helped a lot. $13 billion of new money into our education system. But it didn't solve all the problems. It didn't solve all the transportation problems. It didn't solve all the special education problems. And it didn't solve all of the education gap problems that we see that need to be fixed through this learning, through the LAP that I keep mentioning. So that would be the first thing, is to increase that multiplier. Right now, we peanut butter the money out across the state so that every school district gets the same amount of money for every student. And from an equality standpoint, that's fine. But it doesn't recognize the equity issues we face in districts in South County, especially in Tukwila, Renton, and Kent, where we've got folks that maybe come from a refugee camp and never spoke English before. Maybe their parents didn't have formal education. And those students have to come up to the same level. So we can get rid of standardized testing, which shows disproportionate negative impact on communities of color. That would save us $10 million. And we can increase the funding, which is targeted towards high poverty and so for example, free and reduced lunch schools as well. We can also continue to push forward community eligibility programs. It's a program that was started under the Obama administration. And what it does is a great thing of taking away the stigma from the poor kids and the rich kids, that everybody gets the same thing. And that's the way breakfast after the bell works in many school districts, is that every kid gets breakfast, and that way there's no stigma, and that way everybody gets ready in the same day. You help with discipline problems, you help with outcomes. So let's stick to the data. Let's look at what's working, and there's a few specifics for you.
Okay, same question, Mr. Hackney.
Sure.
How would you adjust the education system
A number
to make it
of
more
different
equitable
ways.
for all students?
Yeah, a number of different ways. I do agree that it is the school system's job to make sure every student is ready for school. And that's not only just breakfast and nutrition, but also counselors. So when students are coming from broken families or crises at home, we have to make sure that they're ready for education. We have to make sure that the faculty and staff reflect the diversity of the students that they're serving. They are serving as role models who can also understand the specific community issues that these students are facing. We have to adjust the school to prison pipeline, where because of zero tolerance policies and other, because of small infractions, students are being removed from school and put into the juvenile justice system. And of course, we have to make sure that we are addressing the needs of every child, including special education and also continuing technical education for students that are better suited for a trade, a high trade job, a skilled trade job, rather than university. We have to look at the school system from a racial social justice lens. And we have to recognize that, again, these issues are not new. So rather than talk about what you're going to do, you can really talk about what you have done and what you have focused on. And it's had not been enough. Even the Breakfast Before the Bell program, I understand, is nothing but poor quality food, sugary, carb food that is not healthy and is not good for students. And so again, you're not just checking boxes, you're solving problems. And so getting there and understanding from parents the concerns that they have because of the poor nutritional value of the breakfasts that are served. And in fact, those breakfasts are served to every student, whether they want it or not. And there's an incredible amount of waste where students whose parents don't want them to eat that sugary mess, feed them at home, and then the other breakfast that they get at school is just thrown away. Again, as legislators, we're problem solvers.
What is your stance
Can I jump in there?
Oh, no, come on.
Yes, please take 1 minute to refute. Mr. Hudgins?
I just breakfast after the bell. I love the breakfast after the bell program. This is a thing that really works well. It helps. I've actually spoken at a couple of national conferences about it. And the objections on the House floor the first year were that hungry kids are more motivated and they'll do better. The second year was kids are going to get fat if we give them 2 breakfasts. I just think that the national standards for the food is set by the federal government, the U.S. Food and Drug, the U.S. Department of Agriculture. And when First Lady Michelle Obama actually raised the standards for nutritional value on these meals, they went in and actually had to redo a lot of, that was one part of the fight the first year, was that the nutritionists were dealing with that. And they had to redo all of the food to meet those new nutritional standards. And what I love about it is that there's a bakery at Airway Heights, and the folks in the state custody at that prison bake goods for Meals on Wheels and for breakfast after the bell. They revamped into low sugar brownies, and those are the brownies that go out to the schools. So they meet this Michelle Obama nutritional value. Prisoners are getting skills, kids are getting fed. I mean, those are the kind of solutions that I've pushed for. It took 5 years to get done. We got Republican votes for it. And that's how you solve big problems. Those are the systemic change that we make. 295 school districts in our state, and they're all doing breakfast after the bell for the most needy kids. It's a great program. It works great. Take your shots at me, but it is a great program. It's feeding kids. It's getting them ready to go to school. Part of the reason teachers and educators, AFT, have endorsed me. It's a great program.
Okay. So again, no one's going to be taking shots. We're going to do this very gracefully and respectfully. So Mr. Hudgins, I'm going to go ahead and ask you my next question, and then I would like Mr. Hackney to answer the same question. What is your stance on Referendum 90, which is the sex education in public schools measure?
I support proper sexual health education in schools. I voted for it in the legislature. I have defended that vote. It's the right thing to do. I'll have to tell you, when I first ran for office, there was a bill up around teaching medically accurate sex education. If a school district taught sexual health education, it had to be medically accurate. I thought, what a crazy world we live in, that we'd have to mandate medically accurate information in schools, but we did. We heard all kinds of crazy testimony from students about what they were being taught in schools. Medically accurate, proper, age-appropriate sexual education, sexual health education is good, and we should sustain that law at the ballot box.
Same question, Mr. Hackney?
Sure.
Do you support Referendum 90?
I do support it. I support it because, again, it allows customization by local school districts, for their communities. I support it because for younger children, it is a safety measure where they can understand what inappropriate behavior is, and that it is age appropriate and again, designed by experts who understand how to teach children and how to address these issues appropriately for the age and the maturity of the students. Because also, again, it has the opportunity for local customization by the school board. I think it makes sense for all districts in the state, and I completely support it.
Okay, next question. Mr. Hackney will answer this first. What are your plans to combat the potential cuts in state services for everyone, especially the most vulnerable and those in need?
Well, I think you have to make the point very clear. For example, University of Washington study shows that when you expand foster care from 18 to 21, you actually save $6 for every dollar you spend. You have to make it clear to your colleagues that cutting social services, cutting needed services for vulnerable communities will only make the economic crisis work. Economic growth happens when working Washingtonians have more earning and spending power. They buy more goods and services, which causes businesses to make capital expenditures and hire more workers. So when you cut issues that impact the income of Washingtonians, then what you're really doing is you're causing the recession and the economic crisis to be deeper and longer. We're going to have to focus and invest in people. And to do that, we are going to have to, one, use the rainy day fund. Two, we are going to have to find new sources of revenue to pay for these expanded services. But when people say, how can you afford to have expanded services? I ask the question, how can you afford not to? We know that the cuts that happened in the legislature in 2008, 2009 disproportionately impacted people of color. And things like, so McCleary protects K through 12, but it did not protect university students. And when you start, and it didn't protect pre-K students. And cuts in those kinds of programs, again, have long-lasting impacts that are going to be much more expensive to address than if we were to address them now by finding new forms of income and preventing defunding of critical social services.
Okay. Same question, Mr. Hudgins?
Well, I'm going to agree in concept with what Mr. Hackney just said, is that any safety net programs help the whole economy. They help the individual and they help the whole economy. People who get unemployment insurance don't just go put that in their piggy bank or stuff it into their mattress, right? They spend that money immediately. It's the same thing with paid sick days or other safety net programs. Things that are keeping the economy afloat in many ways and for many people. So the question becomes, how do we keep those programs in place? How do we make them more robust? And I'm going to be a little bit more specific. At the beginning of the year, we're looking at an $8 billion shortfall. That's just to do what we are doing now. The latest revenue forecast shows that we're about a $4 billion shortfall, which is an enormous amount of money. The rainy day fund is about $3.5 billion of that. So we'll use the rainy day fund. We think that we'll only need a 50% vote for that because the economy is still down and the averages are still so low. There are triggers about when you can get to that rainy day fund. So we'll use that. And then the expectation is that we're still going to be short. So there will be some cuts. The state government has already stopped travel. We've done a hiring freeze, many things that we've done through the last recession. I was there during the last recession and the cuts were horrible and it was difficult to raise taxes. We did raise taxes. I've raised taxes a number of times in a very targeted way so that you give credits for jobs created, for example, or you go after the largest banks in the world, for example. We've also created a new tax for higher education. I mentioned the Workforce Investment Act so that we fully funded state need, and that was a targeted tax on high tech that the big tech and the high tech in our state asked for so that they could get more workers. Now, when it comes to new taxes, first thing is that we need to fix our upside down regressive tax system. We know that even if we do that in the legislature, it's going to go through litigation, but the legislature needs to move for that. I've supported that for years. I think people do better under progressive income tax system than they do now. We also need to look at other things. A data tax, there's a discussion about a millionaire's tax. There's a discussion about a billionaire's tax as well. And there's a number of options on all of those things. That's how we get out of our recession, is by investing in people, higher education, for example, not destroying the safety net, and of looking for new and sustainable ways. Capital gains tax, for example, is something that I've supported. An estate tax, I've supported that as well. There's some discussion about an inheritance tax, and these would hit very few people. I think the billionaire's tax, for example, is only 12 individuals in the entire state. The capital gains tax that was proposed that I supported, has votes in the House but not the Senate currently, is about 13,000 people in the whole state. So there is a way of making people pay more, pay their fair share, pay for the benefits that they've received from the investments that we've made in our state, and then to protect that safety net and to fill the budget hole.
Okay. For Mr. Hackney, how will you implement the programs and services needed for the residents of the 11th district with the large budget deficit that will hit in January?
How will I implement? So as a legislator, I will work with my colleagues to prevent, again, cuts in these services. And so as my opponent mentioned, that is going to have to be to address our upside down tax system and to promote progressive taxes on the more wealthy individuals. The best I can do is I can stand strong to vote against, again, cuts that impact the earning and spending power of residents of the 11th LD, that impact education, that impact access to healthcare. I think we also need to continue capital projects, reinvesting in our infrastructure. Those bring jobs, and those jobs, of course, again, increase the earning and spending power. So we need to make sure that we continue, again, investing in people, investing in infrastructure, even during this crisis, or the result will be that this pandemic and this public health crisis, this economic crisis that happens because of this pandemic will be even deeper and last longer. So we're going to have to be able to make smart investments. And we can also find ways we can cut the Department of Correction budget. We can deal with mass incarceration. We can start releasing individuals and have a reentry program for them that will not have a Department of Corrections identification card, but will have a Washington State ID card, so that when they go to look for housing and employment, they won't go with the stigma of being recently released. So there's a lot we can do, and a lot that should have been done a long time ago. This crisis is basically showing a spotlight on the cracks in our legal system and our economic system, and they should have been addressed a long time ago.
Okay, same question, Mr. Hudgins. How will you implement the programs and services needed for the residents of the 11th district, considering the large budget deficit that's going to hit us in January?
Sure. Well, let me give you two examples of things that I'm going to be advocating for. Universal child care and universal broadband access. Two things that I've been working on for years, two things that I actually had a committee hearing today about them, about the digital broadband stuff. These are things that if we invest money now, they will benefit us now, and they will pay dividends going forward. And they're going to benefit everybody, not just folks dealing with sitting at home with broadband issues because their kids on the school laptop. This is about economic development across the state in rural areas, in areas that are disproportionately impacted by the growth in Seattle. These are two things that we are going to be focused on in the next session and that I've supported. Talk about how do we do this? Well, last year we passed a bill that put all of our broadband into one office. This is an innovative thing that I led and fought for. And now it's all up and running, and we push money out through the Curb Board and through the Public Works Trust Fund to help the local agencies put projects on the ground. It's a very similar model to how we do Housing Trust Fund. So last year we did some policy bills around affordable housing, protecting people from rent discrimination about where they get their income, protecting people around grace periods, putting grace periods into the law, making sure that we've got proper notification extensions, make sure that people have more time to pay installments. And then we put $138 million into building projects. And you see these projects all over the 11th district that have had some support from the Housing Trust Fund. The Sunset Housing Project, there's a housing project at El Centro up on Beacon Hill. There's one in South Park from Cesar Chavez. These housing projects, even the Department of Veterans housing project through Compass Housing in Renton is something that benefited from state help. All of these housing projects are great infrastructure, just like David said, they're good things. And then they also put people to work, they're good jobs. And then we also have eviction protections, foreclosure help, and prevention programs as well. So working through some of those specific programs and pushing money out into our communities are how I would implement some of these programs to help get us through this budget problem.
Okay, thank you. So research shows that there are, gender wage gaps and racial disparities regarding wage. Do you think national legislation would help close that gap? Mr. Hackney, please.
Sure. I mean, the United States Congress has the ability to mandate employment law improvements. And so one things that can be done and how you can address it is to have more ability to see what others are making, more visibility, so that individuals, when companies have to report the salaries and wages that they're paying as public employers have to do, it's easier to identify. One of the issues is that it's hard to know that you're being discriminated against when wages, they don't have any transparency. And so the Congress has the ability to do it, as does the state, but setting federal standards will make it so that all businesses have to comply with the same standards. And so doing it state by state, you will have, some states will have better standards than others. So you can, you mandate transparency, and then mandate opportunities for individuals to take legal action to make sure that they are being paid fairly and equitably. And so again, that access can come. You can sue on federal issues in state court as well as federal court. And again, by doing this on a national scale, you will prevent states from either competing against one another to get corporations to come because they have lax standards, so a race to the bottom, and you'll have a national standard that would improve the income inequality that is currently being experienced by people of color and women, and also people with disabilities. So it addresses a number of groups, and the federal government is an appropriate tool to do so.
Thank you. Same question, Mr. Hudgins. Do you think national legislation is a way to close the gender and racial wage gap?
Sure, but don't hold your breath. I mean, I think that the federal government moves slow. I think the federal government is slow and watered down at best, and it's the floor at best. So here in Washington State, we passed the Equal Pay Opportunity Act. It was led by Representative Sen from the 41st District. And the next step to that is not just passing what the floor should be or the ceiling. It's not that we're all going to turn blue holding our breath waiting for the federal government to solve some of these problems. It's that we have started that process, and the next piece is about collecting the data and enforcing those laws. I can give you an example. The Office of Women and Minority-Owned Business Enterprises got enforcement authority this year because of a bill that passed, came through my committee. These are folks that help certify women and minority-owned businesses, like the one my wife runs. And I'll tell you that for years, people complained that there weren't enough certifications or that the office wasn't working well. Giving enforcement authority puts teeth in the law. So that's what we can do at the state level, is not wait for the federal government, even though it's a good place to get legislation passed to set a national standard. But we don't have to wait for the federal government. We can do it here. We have, and the next step is about enforcement and data collection around those things. It's also one of the reasons why we've set up the Office of Equity at the state level. It needs to be funded better, but we have put that into place, and it's going to look internally to make sure that the state government is working with an equity lens. It's a new thing. It hasn't kicked in all the way yet, but it's a step in the right direction, and it's a solution that will provide greater benefits going forward and help solve some of these big problems.
Okay, thank you. So several years ago, Boeing received a $9.5 billion tax break from the state of Washington. And news came out just today that they are planning to move the 787 Dreamliner to South Carolina, which of course will have a tremendous a tremendous economic impact on the Snohomish area. And it's going to cost several thousands of jobs to be lost. The question is this just another ploy to get the state to give them another large tax break? Of course, the issue is going to be addressed at the upcoming legislative session. If elected or re-elected, what will you do to convince other legislators to keep the Boeing 787 in Everett? So, Mr. Hudgins, please.
Thank you for that question. And I'll tell you, let me start by saying I think it's a huge mistake for Boeing to move production to South Carolina for a bunch of reasons. Let's just start with, they've already had problems on their production line with quality on the 737 line there. Let's start with the depth of experience, of skills, and dedication of the workforce here in Washington State. And let's continue on to talk about the history in Washington State and the willingness of our state government to support the Boeing company. I was in the legislature during the last tax fight, and I'll tell you, I agree. I do think that it is a ploy by the Boeing company to try and squeeze the taxpayers of Washington State for more money. The first package to get the Dreamliner initially built here, the 777, and later the 787, they would like those manufacturing tax credits applied to their entire line. We already give them a number of tax breaks, not just on manufacturing B&O, but on sales tax, for example. There's no sales tax on the sale of commercial airliners. So it becomes, in some ways, a question of cost. It becomes a question of politics and a question of clawbacks. So we can give them a tax break as long as they're creating jobs in Washington State. And then they lose the tax break when those jobs go away. We've done this with silicon manufacturers, especially Wafer Tech down in the Vancouver area. You put clawbacks into the law. We put accountability measures into the law on the last tax break, but now they want to expand it to their different lines. And that's where the political fight's going to be. I will fight tooth and nail to keep every Boeing job I can here in Washington State, but there is going to be a question about what it's going to cost. And we can't just give away the farm to keep jobs here that they would go someplace else. They clearly didn't learn when they outsourced their jobs around the world on their carbon fiber work. They didn't learn from their quality issues. They didn't learn from their costs. That Washington State has got the best workforce in the nation. It's got the best aerospace cluster in the nation. And that this is why they make great products here. And this is why they have a great workforce here, is because people are dedicated to the company and to quality and to safety. And I don't believe that's the same in South Carolina.
Okay, thank you. Same question, Mr. Hackney?
Sure. I agree that this was a short-sighted decision and a wrongful decision by Boeing. And it is designed to take advantage of the state by attempting to get more tax cuts. And in fact, it's absolutely the wrong way to go. We are going to have to understand that these good union jobs, that these quality workers, and the skill and that they have put in, and the innovation that they have put into these products is in the long run going to be much better for Boeing than by outsourcing them to South Carolina, where they don't have the same quality workforce. I think we are going to have to negotiate hard with them, and not just clawbacks where the tax refunds or the tax breaks will go away, but also if they tend to move within a certain period of time, they would have to refund the tax breaks that they've already received. It is definitely, sometimes you definitely have to play hardball, but you never negotiate against yourself. So if you're continually giving tax breaks and bigger tax breaks, or we're going to leave, or bigger tax breaks, or we're going to leave, eventually you're going to recognize that they will take everything from you and they can still leave. The government cannot prevent a private corporation from moving business from one state to the other. So we have to find a better way to negotiate where we're not negotiating against ourselves and just being taken advantage of.
Okay, thank you. My next question is regarding voting. As you know, it's really hard for some community members to register to vote or go out and cast their ballots. How do you propose we overcome these obstacles, and what will you do to help communities who are struggling to cast their vote or get to the voting booth? Mr. Hackney, please.
I agree. We have already, motor voter when you register for a driver's license. I think we have to do more outreach. I think we have to have more funding for community service organizations. We need to make sure that we have those services in multiple languages. The 11th district has a very poor voting record, and it's unfortunate because the needs of this community in South King County are in many ways greater than other areas of the county. So again, this is a problem that is going to get solved with resources, community-based organizations that are funded to organize individuals to register to vote, and also to get them to get out to vote at the appropriate time. So we need to, I think, we pretty much, I would also look into same-day voter registration. I think we have the technology. It is available in other states so that individuals can register and also vote at the same time. With our mail-in ballot system, there will be a way to verify registrations before votes are counted. So we need to remove as many barriers as we can. The barriers, of course, are language, not familiarity with the voting system, and not a real understanding and education of how much their vote matters. So I think we need to have a concentrated effort, particularly in South King County in the 11th district, to make it easier for people to vote.
Thank you. Mr. Hudgins, same question.
Well, thanks for the question. This is something that is really close to my heart that I've worked on my entire adult life. I volunteered in my first election when I was 15 years old. I worked on one of the closest congressional races in the country when I was 17 years old. It's something that motivated me to go to Baghdad in 2004 to help them get ready for their first elections. I've been to Ukraine and Kyrgyzstan to help them with their local elections as well. When I was the chair of the State Government and Elections and Information Technology Committee, we passed a package of bills that was a model for the nation. Again, solving a local problem, creating systemic change that became a model for the nation. We passed same-day voter registration in our state. It was a Lori Dolan and Patty Kuderer bill. And it is modeled off of what 14 other states do, including Wisconsin, which has been doing it since the 1970s. You can currently go into the election office in Renton in King County up until 8 p.m. and get registered and get a ballot and vote. That's amazing. I'll tell you, we've also did pre-registration for 16 and 17-year-olds because oftentimes if you're 16, you get your driver's license, you miss your first election, you don't get the habit of voting. We did automatic voter registration. So it changes from motor voter from an opt-in to an opt-out. So that increased the number of voters in our state as well. One of my greatest, I think, accomplishments was in 2015, King County only had 10 ballot boxes on the ground in the entire county. 2 million people, 10 ballot boxes. Tacoma had 10 on the ground. Now we passed a law, we mandated more, 1 per 15,000 registered voters. There are 561 ballot boxes across the state. I'll tell you, we fought for money for the census, and so we need more money to get out to community organizations. It's another great model to use, not just to get everybody counted, which we need to do, but to make sure we use community groups to push out and to turn out voters as well. We've also passed legislation to create more transparency in where money's coming from, to fight dark money. We passed the Voting Rights Act in Washington State because of what the Supreme Court did. We've passed the Native American Voting Rights Act in Washington State as well. I was proud to be a leader in these areas. Thanks for that question.
Can I have a quick rebuttal?
Sure, take 1 minute, please.
I just want to note there's only one ballot box in Tukwila, and it's not near where people can easily get to it. It's by the community center. So again, we're not just checking boxes. We need to actually solve problems. And so there's a lot of people in the community that have a difficult time getting to that ballot box, particularly people in the Somali community, where their apartment complexes are well far from it, and it is very difficult to get to the ballot box by public transportation.
Mr. Hudgins, would you like to address that?
Add to that, just real quick. You're right, David. We don't have enough ballot boxes on the ground. King County is supposed to have 105. We've only got about 80, so we need more on the ground. We also paid for prepaid postage in the state. All of those bills were also signed by the governor at Foster High School. It was one of the great moments to have students there watching laws get put into place. So you're right, we need to do more, but we've really taken some really good, great leaps forwards in the last time.
Okay, thank you for that. My next question is regarding the presidential debate last night. And one thing that really concerns me was the fact that our administrator, in my opinion, blew the dog whistle to the Proud Boys to stand down and stand by. And what was concerning for me was that neither Vice President Biden nor the moderator spoke up against this. My question is, do you think something should have been said in that moment? And if so, what would you have said if you were in that arena? So, Mr. Hackney, please.
Sure, I think you should always feel confident to call out racism. So by not in essence condemning the Proud Boys or other white supremacist groups, you are in fact supporting them. The problem, of course, was that the president of the United States was bullying and over talking. And so I don't know if it was necessarily a failure of the other participants or just the president's inability to let the other person talk. But clearly, in circumstances when I see particularly overt examples of racism, it is imperative that we stand up. When we see overt examples of someone being discriminated because they're an immigrant, because they don't speak our language, because they have a disability, it is allowing that to go on without stepping up and stepping forward and saying something is just as almost as bad as the perpetrator. So I will always stand up when I see particularly overt discrimination, whether it's explicit or like when the president failed to condemn white supremacists and merely told the Proud Boys, which is an identified white supremacist organization, to merely stand by and wait, or whatever he said, which was not appropriate.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Hudgins, same question.
Well, I'll tell you that David and I may not agree on everything. We may throw mud at each other, but if we were on a stage, I'd want to give him a hug just to show what an aberration that presidential debate was. You can have a civil disagreement. You can have a discussion about the issues. You can both be committed to the community. Not standing up against hate, not standing up against white supremacy is a terrible, terrible, terrible thing. And the president of the United States is not just doing dog whistles. He called Mexicans rapists and criminals from the very beginning of his presidential campaign. He has played people against each other in this country in a way that shouldn't happen. We need somebody that cares about the American people. And if I'm elected, if David's elected, we will care about the 11th district. We will not do anything that is overtly racist against the 11th district. And that's the aberration. That is the disgustingness. That is how horrible our president is right now. So yes, Joe Biden should have said something. The moderator should have said something. It's also such a shock that this stuff is in our face. We've become exhausted and outraged so much that sometimes it's difficult to figure out exactly how to push that back. We need to stand in our communities against this. We need to stand against hate. We've changed hate crime laws in our state. And I will stand with anybody that is standing against hate. We need to do that.
Okay. So we're running low on time.
Masked up.
I'm sorry?
I said, and I'd give David a hug.
Oh, okay.
We're all masked up on stage.
Okay. So we're running low on time, so I just want to invite attendees. If you have a final question, please type it in the Q&A, and I'll be happy to ask our guest the question. While you're typing in the chat, I actually have one more question. I'm curious to know, what has been the biggest professional mistake you have made, and how did you overcome those challenges? So let's start with Mr. Hudgins. What has been your biggest professional mistake and how did you overcome it?
That is a great question. Wow, what a big question. So I will, this is something that David's brought up a few times. In the legislature against a bill that would have changed how eviction laws worked. There was a problem with the bill. It needed to be fixed. Advocates said it needed to be fixed. I was worried about fighting big tech companies for people's privacy. I made a mistake not doing that, I think, and voting against it. I voted for it the next year when the fix was there. So I'm on the record as voting for those changes. But I think I probably would have done it a little bit differently.
Okay, thank you. Same question, Mr. Hackney. What was your biggest professional mistake and how did you overcome it?
I would say that my biggest professional mistake, I was the lead employment attorney at the Nature Conservancy for both domestic and international labor issues. And I designed our employee relations dealing with complaints in a way without fully taking into account how things are done internationally and how and I made it too American. And I didn't recognize that when you are dealing in a global situation, you need to make sure that you take into account the customs of various countries and how they do things, and in particular how they address performance issues and terminations. And so by not having a system that was completely based on the American system, it was a disservice to those employees as well as to the business as a whole. And once I got the complaints and I learned from my mistake, I was able to customize our employee relations system for the individual customs of the various countries that we operated in.
Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to give you both 3 minutes to give a final statement. So, Mr. Hudgins.
Well, I just want to thank you for sticking with us for this whole time. An hour and a half is a long time to listen to candidates. Usually we get 30 seconds at the door or on the phone or something like that. I feel like my values, working for the people of the 11th District, passing big pieces of legislation that have shown systemic change in the education system, whether it's with McCleary, whether it's with the DREAM Act, whether it's with Breakfast After the Bell, the Workforce Investment Act, large systemic changes in our democracy to make it easier for folks to vote. The same-day voter registration, bringing the governor to Tukwila to sign that bill in front of students. Automatic voter registration, same-day voter registration, as I mentioned, the Voting Rights Act, the Native American Voting Rights Act, big changes to how we do our democracy, breaking down those barriers, trying to make sure that we get a better participation in our system. Same thing goes with fighting Republicans around public disclosure reform, or fighting for the first public option in healthcare, fighting for 100% clean energy. I believe that our values are shown in where we spend our time and our talent. My time and talent has been spent fighting Republican agenda to hurt people. It has been spent helping communities. It has been spent in the communities, bringing home projects, building housing, helping with affordable housing. It has been spent creating opportunity. I'd very much like anybody's support out there in the 11th District, and I want to thank you very much for your time tonight.
Mr. Hackney?
I'm running because I believe the 11th District is ready for change. I'm running because I believe the status quo is unacceptable, and I think it can be changed. I'm running because of the stigma of mass incarceration and the blatant, systemic racism that we see in both in how we police and how we deal out justice in this community. I'm running because the 11th District needs someone to fight on these critical issues. Someone who is going to be both in Olympia and in the community, to be a leader, to fight for issues that will address income inequality, to fight for initiatives and issues that will address gun violence, and of course, to fight for renters protection. You know, again, you can tell by the passion in my voice, but you can also tell by the activities in this community that I have been a fighter on these issues. I have been out in the streets. I have been out in the community. I have been working on them, and I will continue to work on them until they are finished. The job is not done when you vote on the House floor. The job is not done when you say Black Lives Matter. You fight and you continue to work with the community to find basically responses to these issues. And I will also say these issues are not new. They could have and should have been addressed a long time ago. And so you can have an opportunity to stay with the status quo, or you can vote for me. The 11th district is ready for change. That message resonated in the primaries. That message resonated in the 11th district. That message has resonated with the King County Democrats and various other organizations. The Alliance for Gun Responsibility have given me their sole endorsement because they know and they have seen me fight on these issues for the community. So we need someone fighting on critical issues to the 11th district. Someone who is going to take this on all year long, all session long, and not just during campaign time. You need to see this activity. And if you haven't seen it before, you should recognize that's because you didn't have a representative that was fighting for you. I will do that. And I'm looking forward to your vote. Thank you very much.
Well, I would like to thank both our guests, our esteemed guests, our legislator and our maybe future legislator. I just want to remind you all that the importance of voting. We need to get out and vote because our lives really do depend on voting this year, this election. Gather your friends, gather your family, mask up, go to your local voting booth, mail in your ballots as soon as you can, and just really engage in this election. As you heard, we have two esteemed candidates, and the decision is hard. But again, vote for the candidate that you believe is going to implement real change, long-lasting change, and that's really going to benefit District 11. So again, thank you so much for participating in our forum, and the recording will be up on social media later on this week. So thank you very much. Have a good evening. Take care.